Welcome to Inside Politics with Kevin Klein, Jeff Courier, and Royce Coop, where we break down the stories shaping our country.
Welcome to another edition of Inside Politics. The election has now been called, so I wanted to get our group together to talk about that. No surprise, probably one of the worst kept surprises we've had for a very long time. The date will be April 28th, according to our interim or our current Prime Minister, Mark Carney. And the guns have already come out blazing on all sides, and the polls are showing us some very different, strange numbers. And a lot of people have reached out to me via email and on our platforms talking about you have to ignore the polls, you have to ignore the polls. But I can see each one of them taking from each other's platform. So I thought, guys, let's make this show about getting the facts out there because I think people have to understand how important this election is, and we need to talk about the facts. So let's start with the polling. Royce, as a professor of political science at the University of Manitoba and columnist for the Winnipeg Sun, what do you really have to tell people about polling and how they should take polling?
Well, in this campaign so far, we've seen we're going to be absolutely inundated by polls. Some are pretty high quality, some aren't. The important thing is to take them as a whole, to look at averages, to look at movement. Right now, we can see that all the pollsters are kind of converging on the view that Mark Carney has brought the Liberal Party back. The party is much more popular. Getting rid of Justin Trudeau made a big difference. But there's other information that pollsters collect that we should also pay attention to. And a really interesting one to me was just yesterday, the Angus Reid Institute released a poll asked Canadians what their top concerns were. You would think if you were watching Canadian media for the last few weeks, and 99% of Canadians would be worried about Trump, worried about tariffs, but that's actually not true. The biggest concern out there amongst Canadians is still cost of living and inflation. So politicians have to speak to that. They have to speak to these concerns. And I don't think Trump is going to figure as prominently. He's not going to dominate this election campaign to the extent that we thought he would, maybe.
Jeff, as a radio host for years, you've talked to many politicians. You've seen polls come and go. Do you suggest that people even pay any attention to polls?
Well, they shouldn't base their vote on the poll, that's for sure. They should base their vote on facts and how they feel and which candidate or which party is going to best represent them. The polls are snapshots, and I know that there's a feeling out there that the pollsters always get it wrong. But the fact is, the pollsters usually get it right. More often than not, the pollsters get it right. Now, it's very, very early in a campaign, and I hearken back to, and Royce will, I think, remember this as well. Justin Trudeau's first campaign to become prime minister, the Liberal Party was so low in the polls, they were looking at a third place finish. Right, the NDP was going to be the official opposition, and in the last couple of weeks of that campaign, the Liberal Party and Justin Trudeau's popularity skyrocketed and shot him to victory. So we're very, very early in a campaign. People don't really know Mark Carney, and they probably don't know Pierre Poilievre very well either. So these two leaders are going to have to get out on the hustings and sell themselves and sell their platforms and deliver the goods. And then Canadians will have to see which one of these two people they think is qualified to be the CEO of this company. But so the polls are kind of a current snapshot. I wouldn't pay too much attention to them just yet.
That's sage advice. Now, you had talked about it, Royce, that the number one concern of Canadians, according to one poll, would be affordability. I have to say that I would echo that 100%. If you take Winnipeg, for example, Mayor Scott Gillingham and the city council here has tacked on more fees and increased taxes than ever before. We're seeing major increases. We saw, as Jeff alluded to in a previous program, the Manitoba government basically jacked our income tax by holding it steady and not making way for inflation. How do the people running, how do we discern what's going to be real and what's not when these leaders are talking about it? Because now we've had Carney come out, I'm going to cut taxes, and Poilievre, I'm going to cut taxes. I mean, it's like watching Oprah Winfrey. You get a tax cut, you get a tax cut, you all get a tax cut. How do we really discern this and say, who's really going to do the cuts? Who's telling us the truth?
Yeah, there's kind of two things here. The first is that One of the big things that makes politics interesting is that it's not just parties and politicians. They don't just respond to public opinion, they shape public opinion. And so that's what we call priming. Politicians prime issues that are going to benefit them. And so right now we know that the top concern amongst Canadians is affordability, it's inflation, but the Liberal Party is putting out advertisements or these kind of weird rambly videos with Mark Carney chit-chatting with Mike Myers about Canadian cultural icons from the 1980s. What the heck is going on here? Well, they're priming Canadian sovereignty, identity, because that's the issue that they can win on. It's probably the only issue they can win on. The second point is that if you want to cut through the noise when it comes to promises about who's going to manage the economy, who's going to keep their promises on tax cuts, well, the Liberal Party has a record. You know, they have 9 years in office. You can look very clearly at their stewardship of the economy. And if you like what you see, if you have enjoyed the last 9 years, then you can get more of it. Whereas Polyev has a much kind of cleaner record. He's a blank slate. And so people do have the ability to do this kind of retrospective voting, to look at the Liberal Party's record and vote on that basis.
Jeff, before you get into the answering that question, I'll give you a quick one. What did you think of the Mike Myers commercial with Mark Carney? I mean, my initial response was, "Excuse me, baking powder." Like, I mean, why would he do that?
Yeah, I have to confess, I pay no attention at all to political ads. I don't watch them.
Oh,
I don't pay
good for
attention
you.
to them.
Wow.
I don't read them. I don't listen to them.
You're my
They're
hero.
meaningless to me.
You're my hero.
Political ads have no resonance with me. They are meaningless. And I would suggest to anybody out there that you should never, ever base your vote on what you see in political ads. The other thing, looking down the road, and I think this kind of builds a little bit on what Royce was talking about, and that is that the tariff war is going to end in months, or it's going to end sooner or later. Right? It's not going to carry on indefinitely. But whoever we elect in this election is going to be in power for 4 years if it's a majority government. We need to take the long view of this. Like, once we get past this tariff situation, then what? What plans do these parties have for stewarding this country through the next 4 years post tariffs? And I think that's the view that I'm trying to take on this.
It will be very interesting because of our debt, and you've talked about it a lot. Let's switch now to interference in the election. We're starting to hear about it right now. We're hearing some people claim that Daniel Smith is trying to get Americans to interfere. People are claiming that Elon Musk, because he owns X, is interfering in the election. Rice, are we now just using this as a tool to scare people into voting a certain way? Because I really don't see Elon Musk owning X as interfering with a Canadian election. People can say whatever they want to say. If you choose to believe them, that's on you.
Yeah, that's the concern, is that the idea of interference is now just being politicized and can be used as a weapon. There was a time when the terms misinformation and disinformation were actually kind of useful in politics. They got us to think about information that wasn't correct, that maybe wants to push us in the wrong direction. But that became totally politicized. Anytime I see the word disinformation in a news story, I'm kind of very dubious about what I'm reading. And the concern is that that's what's happening with this idea of interference. Reality is Canada is vulnerable to foreign interference. The major player in this respect has been China in the last few elections, and we do need robust safeguards against that kind of thing. Government needs to be tougher about that. But I agree with you. I really kind of hate to see this enter the language of politics and have it turned into a political weapon.
Well, it's difficult to determine for those of us on the outside. I mean, there are only a few people who would actually know about foreign interference in our elections. So for the most part, we're left to speculate. We do know, as Royce pointed out, we do know that China has had its tentacles into Canada, and there are probably other countries and other players as well. And it would be naive of us to think that there aren't any American interests who are trying to influence the outcome of our election. But to what extent they are, it's really impossible for most of us to say.
Speaking of information, I did see online that Daniel Smith was saying, because Mark Carney apparently said he's not going to get rid of the emissions cap, that if he doesn't get rid of the emissions cap, there's a good chance that they'll have a referendum and they could leave Canada.
Well, there's often a lot of bluster coming out of Alberta. I think that's it's a bargaining chip. It's a bargaining tool. I don't see it happening.
I spent most of my life there. It's home. I remember it being a thing many decades ago where people
Well,
wanted.
you've been listening to this. We're going to leave Canada. We're going to leave Canada for decades.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
maybe it's time.
It's hard to take it seriously.
Yeah, I'm a fan of Danielle Smith. I think she's conducted herself very well, but I have to be honest, this is a national election, and I think if Danielle Smith wants to help the federal Conservatives, she should maybe take a month-long vacation and not speak to reporters for that. And I say that I love you, Danielle, but yeah, there are more people voting in this election than Albertans, and so nothing wrong with representing the interests of Albertans, but there's other things happening here right now.
All right. Well, we intend on Inside Politics to follow up on a lot of the issues that are coming out, a lot of the promises that are made. The one thing I do want to talk about, because not that many promises have been made that we already don't know about. They're all going to cut taxes. They're all going to get rid of the carbon tax or at least hide it. Blah 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 blah. It's funny the CBC cuts haven't come up. None of the leaders are talking about cutting back on the CBC. I think that should be something that is spoken about. I think that's a big deal, and let's get it on the table. Let's get some promises. I do want to talk about before we wrap up this episode about Carney saying he won't debate in French. I think he should have said, I can't debate in French, but he won't debate in French. Does that hurt him anywhere other than Quebec?
Well, no, but boy, if you don't win Quebec, it's awful hard to win power in this country.
Valid.
That's a good question, actually. Now that you said that, I kind of wonder about that. You know, in places outside of Quebec, being able to speak French, being able to communicate to Francophone Canadians has sometimes been quite important, especially in Ontario. You know, yesterday when he announced that he wasn't going to do that, apparently it caused quite the stir in Quebec media and the Quebec cultural scene. People are not happy about that. You know, Mark Carney is doing quite well in Quebec in the polls right now. That might be reflected, but actually, that's a great question, Kevin. I wonder if it will hurt him outside of Quebec as well. It well could.
Well, his numbers in the polls that are going up, and we've talked about this, and I'll keep saying it, they're not because of him. I think when you look at the data right now, what's available, and we've talked about polls, his surge is because nobody wants to vote for the NDP across the country, and the Parti Québécois in Quebec have dropped in the ratings as well, have dropped in the polls. So of course that NDP drop and the Parti Québécois drop automatically goes to the Liberals. That can change in 4 weeks.
Oh yeah, I think this does nothing but a favor for the bloc. That Carney is either unwilling or unable to debate in French. That his French just isn't solid enough. I mean, that's Quebec is the base. That's the Liberal Party's base right there. And if you drop down in Quebec, it makes winning a majority government very difficult. And it's a very sensitive topic in the province of Quebec.
Okay.
That if you've got a federal leader who can't communicate in both official languages, that's a problem for you in Quebec.
We're both old guys, or all of us are old guys. Royce isn't as old. But let's look at the US election as much as we don't want to. Trump barely took part in any debates for leadership of the Republicans, right? He didn't take part in any of those debates because he figured I already won. And when you look at it from both sides, Democrats and Republicans, they didn't want to have any debates either.
Well,
Are
it's
politicians walking away from debates and saying, you know what, it's just a media mess because the media is terrible in Canada. You can't
okay, but
trust
that's
certain media, so why not
all of
walk
that's
away?
all of that's true, and most Canadians don't watch the debates. The salient point here, I think, and be interested to hear what Royce thinks. I think the salient point is the message to Quebecers is I can't communicate with you, and it doesn't matter if they were going to watch the debates or not. The message is I can't relate to you. I'm not relatable to you. If you're a French speaking Quebecer, you can't relate to me and I can't relate to you. Never mind the debate. I think that's what it comes down to on an emotional level.
Yeah. I like the debates for a lot of reasons, for democratic reasons. I hate to see politicians back out of them at all. But Jeff is exactly right. Like Quebec is a kind of insulated place. They've got their own media and they have their own concerns. And one of the big concerns is the French language, the preservation of the French fact in Canada. And so these debates have they're much more important within the context of Quebec, these French language debates. And so it's not going to do them any good. And it also opens them up to attacks from the other leaders. Poilievre's French is, as far as I can tell, it's pretty much flawless, and Poilievre hasn't taken off in Quebec. This might create an opportunity for that to actually happen in this campaign. Jeff alluded to this earlier. Campaigns matter, and sometimes they matter a lot. And I think in this campaign, it might matter a lot. The things the leaders do, the campaigns might have a real effect on the end result.
All right, gentlemen, thank you. We'll have our next episode of Inside Politics on Friday. That we'll record it on Friday, just so you know, and then we post it on Saturdays. If you have something that you would like us to look into or a topic you would like us to discuss, I know I'll give you guys a heads up. I got an email from somebody in Alberta. It was a very, very good email. The first time they watched the show, they didn't really understand politics outside of Alberta. Now that you've probably watched this episode and heard Jeff, you probably don't like Jeff, but that's okay. We'll don't worry about that. Well, I'll take care of him being an Alberta guy. They wanted us to talk about why does it seem politics is so different in every province, and especially in Manitoba, because Manitoba they thought would be considered Western Canada, and they look at the politics. They've watched a few episodes of our show, and they're saying, well, Manitoba is not really part of Western Canada, or is it? So we're going to talk about that in the next episode. But if you have something or something the leaders are talking about that you want us to look into, please send it to the email that you see on your screen right here. If you wouldn't mind following our YouTube page and liking it, we would appreciate that as well. Gentlemen, I will talk to you in a couple of days. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.